Trish, Abbey. I am a clinical therapist that works with mostly older adults. And I wanted to talk about grief today because in my practice working with older adults, grief is probably the #1 concern I see for older adults that I'm working with. And actually, as we know as therapists, grief is a problem that comes up across the board in every age group, in every culture, in every situation. So it's good to just get a refresher on grief and a refresher on how we handle that. So I'm going to share my screen. So if you just give me one moment here to share my screen, give me just a second, and then I will. So you should be seeing right now, you should be seeing green hills, which reminds me of Ireland and happy St. Patrick's Day. And hopefully, if I can get to here. Now this worked earlier, so I'm not sure why it's not working now. There we go. And all right, it should take one moment here to load, hopefully. So when we're talking about grief and broken, we're talking about, I'm going to go back here. So grief defined. We all know what grief is, but I'm a huge dictionary person. I, as some people know, I read the dictionary as a kid. I just love definitions. So the dictionary definition of grief is deep sorrow, especially that's caused by someone's death. The synonyms are sorrow, misery, sadness, anguish, pain, distress, and agony. In that, I choose to focus on the word anguish because it really conveys to me what people are going through when they're going through grief. Anguish is an emotion to me that shows the immense amount of hurt and pain. So grief is an acute pain that accompanies loss. Because it is a reflection of what we love, it can feel all-encompassing. Grief is not limited to the loss of people, but when it follows the loss of a loved one, it may be compounded by feelings of guilt and confusion, especially if the relationship was a difficult one. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when relationships are difficult. How do we process that grief? We're going to talk a little bit about that further on. So it's not very clear, and I apologize. I'm not sure it didn't transfer over very well, but I love this quote. I share this quote with people all the time, and it means a lot to me as a therapist working with somebody. Grief, I've learned, is just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All the unspent love gathers in the corner of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in the hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. And so when I'm working with clients, we talk about this and we talk about that last line that says grief is just love with no place to go. And we need to help people to develop a place to go with that love, to start to rebuild where that love goes when you can't love the person in person. So there are many types of grief, and this list is not exhaustive. And we're not going to talk about every type of grief here today because it would take all day. But there are many types of grief. So normal grief, someone passes away. I don't like the word normal because there is no real normal grief. But typical grief is just what it means. Anticipatory grief, we're going to talk about today. Anticipatory grief is grieving a loss that hasn't happened yet. And so that can be with somebody who is going to pass away. It can be a loss of freedom in terms of somebody has Alzheimer's and it's going to get worse. It can be many things, and we'll talk about that. Complicated and chronic grief are grief that don't resolve in quote unquote normal time frames. Again, there is no normal in grief, but when we have complicated grief or chronic grief, that's grief that extends past the normal grieving period and may lead into more issues in mental health. Distorted or cumulative grief. Cumulative grief is when you have multiple losses, and we see this often with older adults because they are losing people at a high rate of speed. Maybe they lose their husband and then their sister passes away, or they have multiple losses in their life within a year. We've seen cumulative grief happening with COVID-19 in that some family members have lost, some families have lost 5 family members with COVID. And so cumulative grief is that compounding grief. Prolonged grief goes along with complicated and chronic. Exaggerated grief. I don't love this word because I don't think anything is exaggerated, but exaggerated grief is when somebody is feeling emotions that might not be fully explained by the loss. Sometimes this is seen in teenagers. Maybe they didn't even know the person that died, but because it's a loss and it's their first loss, that grief can be really exaggerated. Or somebody with mental illness sometimes can have exaggerated grief. Secondary loss is when you are working with somebody. It's what we go through sometimes when somebody passes away and we're counseling clients and we can actually feel that loss that they have. And then absent grief is when the person is not grieving yet. Maybe we've met these people who have lost somebody and they seem just fine. And maybe that absent loss is not yet registering with them in terms of grief. So we're going to talk about anticipatory grief. So as the name suggests, anticipatory grief is the reaction to a death you're able to anticipate, such as when an individual dies from a long-term illness. As soon as you accept and understand that someone you love is going to die, you begin grieving. So those moments when you're told, someone has 6 months to live, the grieving process really starts then. Grief that occurs preceding a loss can be confusing, as you may feel conflicted or guilty for experiencing grief reactions about someone who is still here. You may experience anger, loss of emotional control, and helplessness. You may also feel grief over the loss of things other than the individual, such as the loss of hopes and dreams for the future and the loss associated with changing roles and family structures. Anticipatory grief is different than the grief response felt after a death and does not necessarily make the latter any easier. I think that's an important point because sometimes we think if you have known somebody is going to pass away, for 6 months, a year, 2 years, sometimes I think we assume that you do your grieving and when it ends, it's okay and people can heal easier. And that's not necessarily true. However, it can allow those who love the individual to slowly and gradually prepare for and absorb the reality of loss. Also, for some, but not all, it allows for meaningful time spent with the individual, lending to a sense of closure and peace. This is really where hospice does their best work. And I have worked with some great hospice agencies. And hospice is really important to help process those feelings and also to start to look at what do we need to do during that time of anticipatory grief to help with the loss. So when we're working with anticipatory grief, it's always important to acknowledge the loss. It's always important to acknowledge the loss right away. So sometimes well-meaning people will say, but he's not gone yet. And it can be very hurtful. So acknowledging the loss, sitting with the loss, allowing space for anger, guilt, judgment, and other negative feelings. Oh, I just noticed my spelling mistakes on that side. I apologize. I don't know what happened there. Allowing space for anger, guilt, judgment, and other negative feelings. This is really important. I, as a therapist, believe so heartily in allowing space, hearing the story, hearing the path that people take, and allowing for all of those feelings to come up. Oftentimes, our goal in life is to make people feel better. And so a lot of times it's hard to allow that space, especially for anger and negative feelings. It's very hard. We want to fix it right away. And healing really takes place in that space of allowing for all of those feelings. It's important if we're working with somebody with anticipatory grief to provide examples on healthy coping skills, such as mindfulness, life review, if somebody really wants to look at what they've accomplished through life. And a lot of times I'll meet with people who say, I didn't really do much. I just worked and raised my kids. Well, let's talk about that. Let's review that. Let's talk about your favorite vacation or your favorite memory. Memory books or posters can be helpful for putting together a photo album or a memory book, can be helpful for the person who is dying, as well as the family member to have afterwards. Exploring spirituality. So again, spirituality is something that is different for every person we work with. We know that culture is so important. I do some presentations on culture, and I'm very clear to say that culture doesn't just mean you're from India, or you're German, or you're Asian. That is part of our culture, but that's not our culture in its entirety. Our culture is, what is our spiritual beliefs? What does our family believe? What do I believe apart from my family and my church family? All of that is really important. So exploring spirituality, what are the feelings about death and dying, and how can we work that spirituality into the work that we're doing with someone else? But really asking those important questions, because not everybody believes in going to a better place. Not everybody believes in that God has a plan. And so I think we need to ask those important questions. What do you believe about death and dying? Discuss changing roles. It's important for family members who are going to be left behind as to what the changing role is going to be. The classic example of this is a young man whose father is dying, and we see the young man say, or we see the father say to the young man, it's time for you to step up and be the man of the family when I pass away. That's a really hard statement, and not exactly the way that I would put it, but discussing changing roles, because roles are going to change, especially if you're an adult child with a parent who is dying. If you're working with an adult child with a parent who's dying, how does that role change? Do you become, do you get into a parenting role with your parent? Bucket list. This is something that can be really important. I had a very good friend who passed away from brain cancer, and the bucket list, idea is, it's presented in common culture as like, I want to go to Hawaii, I want to parasail, I want to do all these exciting things. But really, the bucket list could be, I want to talk to my childhood friend again one more time. I want to go visit my mom and dad's grave before I pass away, so I can express those feelings. It doesn't have to be a huge bucket list, just things that want to be accomplished. It's also important to remember that the caregiver needs attention. Caregivers need, a lot of times when we're working with somebody who is dying, we're focused on that person and forgetting about the caregiver. Disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief can occur when the loss comes from other feelings about the loss. This could be after a long period of suffering, a suicide, or the passing of an abusive partner. This also can occur when society does not recognize the loss as significant or worthy of grief, such as a gang member who is shot, a pet lizard, or a drug overdose. So again, when we're talking about disenfranchised grief, we're talking about losses that maybe society doesn't recognize so much. So, when somebody who has accomplished so much in their life passes away, the world comes out to admire them and to talk about them. When someone who is homeless has passed away, no one is talking about that. No one is doing that. And even they may say, oh, well, it's better that he passed away so he doesn't have to be homeless anymore, or a drug overdose. He's not in pain anymore. But the truth is that disenfranchised grief can really confuse the person who is dealing with that grief, and can really, especially the idea that their life wasn't as worthy as someone else's. And so when we're working with disenfranchised grief, we need to allow space for all feelings. There are no right feelings about grief. So if an abusive parent passes away and someone is happy about that, there is no right feeling. We can't say that's not the right feeling to have. We have to allow for all of those feelings to come into being. Explore the relationship with the deceased and its impact on the person. So that means with my work, what I'm doing is I'm looking at that relationship. I'm exploring all of those unsaid things, and exploring how to heal the heart of the person who is left behind in that relationship. Letters written but not sent can be very helpful in this type of work, and can help somebody to process their feelings about it. And also to give a name for the feelings and finding others in the same situation. So especially, I've talked to people who have lost loved ones to drug overdose. And I think it's very hard for them to find somebody to commiserate with. They go to a grief group and maybe in the grief group, everybody has lost their spouse who was their spouse for 40 years. And they're talking about how wonderful their life was together. That's not the same for maybe somebody who was living with an addict or had an addict in their family. Those aren't the same feelings. So giving a name to those feelings, allowing those feelings to be heard, and finding others in the same situation is so important. So now we're going to talk about chronic grief. So chronic grief are strong grief reactions that do not subside and last over a long period of time. Continually experiencing extreme distress over the loss with no progress towards feeling better or improving function. Could include exaggerated, extreme, and excessive grief reactions, possibly to include nightmares, self-destructive behaviors, drug abuse, thoughts of suicide, abnormal fears, and the development or emergence of psychiatric disorders. Can lead to major depression. So what's important to know about that is that chronic grief, it lends itself to being very persistent, and the person doesn't get better. Now, while there is no timeline on grief, we can't say that, after a year, someone is supposed to be this much better, or after 2 years, someone is supposed to be this much better. There is a timeline for healing in terms of we want people to rejoin life at some point in time. We want people to to find their happiness again, to find contentment again. And so chronic grief prevents that from happening. It's more likely to happen with somebody who already had mental health issues, or sometimes in rushed deaths or unexpected deaths. Chronic grief can be a factor. It's in the DSM, we call it persistent complex bereavement disorder, because that's a fun word to say. But chronic grief is definitely an issue that we see and that we can work with. So working with chronic grief, there should never be a timeline for grief. And this is important to acknowledge to people, because what happens for people who are suffering with chronic grief is they hear, aren't you over that by now? You should be doing this. Oh, I know Anne who lost her husband and she's already, remarried 2 years later. Why aren't you dating again? Or why aren't you participating in life again? So it's important to acknowledge that there is no timeline for grief, and that whatever the person is feeling is the right feeling for them at the moment, but we can maybe help them to get to a better place. So chronic grief may need to have professional intervention with a therapist. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be used to help with recurring and invasive thoughts. Medication may be recommended along with therapy. Support groups may not be helpful unless it is with others who are dealing with chronic grief. This is really important. A lot of times in any type of grief, a lot of times we refer people to grief support groups. And I have had many clients who have had huge success and loving their grief support groups. But a lot of times what we do when we send somebody off to a grief support group is we think that they're going to get the help they need. But what actually happens if they can't identify with somebody in the room, if they can't identify with the issues that people are talking about, then again, we have this problem of them seeing themselves as different and unhealthy. Rituals can become important, but can become invasive. So this is, I had a client many years back who was grieving the loss of her mother and father who died about 2 months apart. And she would go to the grave site every day. And so this was a ritual for her that she thought was healing her. But what happened was it became invasive in her life. She couldn't do other things because of this ritual that she felt she needed to do. And so redefining that ritual to once a week, or redefining that ritual as to you can light a candle in the morning, that was important work for her to be able to rejoin in life. So I want to talk a little bit about rituals right now, because there are 4 kinds of rituals. So continuity rituals are, when a loved one is lost, but is still a part of life, the bond is still there. So it's a ritual to kind of keep that bond still there. So it might be celebrating their birthday, doing the things that they love to do to keep that continuity going. There's transitional rituals, which make a change. And that means like, that's the rituals of like cleaning out the house, getting rid of the clothes finally. That's a ritual that's performed that helps with transition into the new life. Now, I was reading something just this morning about, it was an article about grief, and it suggested to removing every bit of reminder of the person in the home, vacuuming behind the couch just in case they drop something behind the couch that would be found 6 months later. That's not on my list of things to do when you're grieving. I don't think you need to remove every reminder, because I think it's okay to be reminded of your loved one often. This article also said keep one picture of the loved one. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could never keep one picture of a loved one. And I don't think my clients could either. So, but having those transition rituals, what in a funeral and grieving process, letting go of balloons, those kinds of things are transition rituals. Affirmation rituals are affirming the relationship that the loved one had. So that could be writing a letter or a poem. It could be putting together that memory book of a book of pictures. I often recommend people do posters, the posters that people see that you see sometimes in the funeral home, but more personalized to you, so that you can look at that poster to remember that. And then there's kind of everyday rituals, which are things like lighting a candle, saying a prayer, talking to the person who is deceased, if you believe that helps. Those everyday rituals that become important in the moving forward. So rituals are important, and we need to make sure that they're not overseen, I guess, and overlooked in terms of that. So we all know that grief is the process of adapting to a new, unfamiliar circumstance. So when we're working with grief, we know that there are, you used to learn about the stages of grief, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. While I love the work that she did, we now know that there aren't really stages of grief. We know that those stages might be mixed up. They might occur at the same time. You can be angry and in denial at the same time. You can get to acceptance and then the next day be back into sadness and grief. So I like the work that some people have done on the tasks. Dr. Warden has done on the tasks of grieving. And so there's 4 tasks of grieving, and one is to accept reality. So that's to accept that the person is gone. Number 2 would be to work through the pain. So this is the work that we're doing when we're working with somebody who has suffered grief. To adjust to life without the deceased. So that's moving forward. What does life look like without the deceased person? And then the 4th is to maintain connection. And that's maintaining connection with the deceased. And that's those rituals. That's those things that bring the deceased person's spirit and life into you. And so those are 4 tasks of mourning that I like to look at when we're looking at grief. We're going to talk a little bit about broken heart syndrome, and then we'll talk about how that works. So broken heart syndrome is a temporary heart condition that's often brought on by stressful events and extreme emotions. The condition can also be triggered by a serious physical illness or surgery. It may also be called stress cardiomyopathy, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, or atypical ballooning syndrome. Women are more likely than men to experience a sudden intense chest pain, the reaction to a surge of stress hormones that can be caused by an emotionally stressful event. It could be the death of a loved one, a divorce, a breakup, betrayal, or romantic rejection. It could even happen after a good shock like winning the lottery. So this is, you've seen this on TV where someone, you throw a surprise party and someone holds their chest and thinks they're having a heart attack. The reason I want to talk about this is because what we see especially with women. And when I'm working with older adults, people who have been married for a very long period of time and have spent every day of their life together, we often see broken heart syndrome in those women. And so they have a health condition on top of their grieving. And so I think it's important to know what it is. They also, people refer to when two people who have lived together forever die within moments of each other, or die within days of each other, that, oh, he died of a broken heart or she died of a broken heart. And I think this can be true. I think that at some point, we all know how our feelings and our emotions and our stress levels impact our health. And so when somebody we love passes away, especially somebody who has been a part of our lives for a very long period of time. Again, I work with couples that have been married 70 years and have spent literally every day together. When someone dies, the physical manifestations of that grief can be really important to look at, can be really important to pay attention to. And so this is one way to bring that to heart. We know that depression, anxiety, and grief all have physical attributes to them. It might be overeating, it might be lack of sleep, it might be pain. Chronic pain can be attributed to psychological issues as well as physical issues. So we need to pay attention to what the physical body is doing and taking care of the physical body while we're also taking care of the mental health. And so that's why, for me, it's always important to recommend exercise, healthy eating, and good sleep habits for somebody in the midst of grief, because it's important to stay healthy. And those stress hormones just mess with our bodies so much that we need to be able to counteract that. So this slide is called Getting Over It. I think it's an interesting thing when people say, when am I going to get over this loss? I hear that a lot. I don't believe in getting over a loss. I believe in getting through it. If anybody has young children, and the bear hunt book, if you've ever read it, we're going on a bear hunt. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. We must go through it. It always reminds me of grief and loss and psychological distress. We don't get over a loss. We go through a loss. So healthy grieving is an active process. It's not true that you just need to give it time. One way of understanding the work to be done is to think of grieving as a series of tasks we need to complete, not necessarily in sequence. So these are some of those tasks, again, a little bit different model than what I was talking about earlier, but again, same idea of getting through a loss, and it's active work. You can't just sit and allow time. Time does not heal every wound, unfortunately. That saying is very harmful to the therapeutic process, because time does not heal every wound. There is work to be done in healing, to accept the finality of the loss, to acknowledge and express the full range of feelings we experience as a result of the loss, to adjust to a life in which the lost person, object, or experience is absent, to say goodbye, to ritualize our movement to a new place with the loss. Good friends, family members, or a personal counselor can all be helpful in doing this vital work. You can also do a good deal to help yourself. So it's important to realize, I don't think everybody who has a loss needs to go to a therapist. Good friends and family members can really be helpful. And some people can do this work on their own. Some people say they want to go through the process by themselves, and that's okay as long as they know that someone is there to help them. So this is my slide about the stages of grief, and I love this slide. It's how we want grief to work. We want it to look like from point A, the loss, to point B, where I am feeling better about life and fully participating. And you can see the second image is how grief actually works. It's a mess. Grief is a mess, and it's supposed to be, and that is the appropriate way for grief to really look when we talk about this. Grief is inevitable. I mean, unfortunately, it's inescapable. We don't get out of this world alive, right? And so if we have relationships with people, and we like those relationships, grief is inevitable. And so when we look at this slide, when we look at how is grief supposed to look, we need to remember that it looks different for every person, for every culture. It may be clean and it may not be, and that's okay. We know that the symptoms of grief are more important than the stages of grief. So again, the symptoms of grief are shock, numbness, shame. It's really important to address shame. It might be in I didn't do enough. I work with a client who she lost her husband, and she continually sits on the fact that he had a bad cough, and he didn't want to go to the doctor, and she didn't force him to go to the doctor. And then he fell and broke his hip, but actually had pneumonia as well. And so, as we know, in older adults, a hip break and pneumonia together are really hard on the body for an older adult. And so she had a lot of shame about that, and she still does. And so we work through that shame. We work through that guilt. Grief can also cause anxiety. And again, we talked about physical symptoms. So it's important to look at not just the stages of grief, but the symptoms of grief. What are we working with? And again, someone might look great for 2 to 3 weeks after the funeral. And then what happens is then, real life comes in again, and that grief gets messy again. Sometimes it's the birthday comes around and grief gets messy again. So again, there can be healing, and then there can be kind of a step back in that healing because of a triggering event. And that's really important to recognize. So when we are looking at working with somebody or just even interacting with somebody that has suffered a loss, it's really important things not to say. This list is put together from a couple places, but I can tell you I've had some really good friends who have lost spouses and loved ones, and I always ask when I'm doing grief presentations, what not to say, and these are some of the few. So at least she lived a long life. Many people die young. So again, that's a hard statement, because even if somebody lived to be 100, it's a loss, and we need to acknowledge that loss. If the person who has that loss says at least she lived a long life, that's great. That's great. But we should not be telling someone to say that loss isn't as important as any other loss. He or she is in a better place. Again, this is cultural. If you believe in heaven and you believe in that setting, then you believe that maybe somebody's in a better place, but maybe the person who's suffering that grief does not believe that. So telling someone he or she is in a better place is just not helpful. This next one is very obvious, but she brought this on herself. We should never say that, especially even in a drug overdose. Again, if the person who is grieving says she brought this on by herself, that's a valid feeling. But for somebody from the outside to say that, that's hard. We hear that right now a lot in the discussion about COVID-19, actually. And what we hear and what I see when I'm on Facebook or social media and people are commenting, well, it's just the old people and the obese people who are dying. So, maybe they should have taken better care of themselves. Maybe they shouldn't have gone to that family party and they died. So there's a lot of feelings about how people died and whether it's a good death to grieve. And I just don't believe in that. So that it's important to recognize that people are saying that to other people, and also just the feelings that are associated with, she or he did this, she or he should have taken better care of themselves. There's a reason for everything. We love this statement, and people love to say this, other is God had a plan, and maybe there isn't. And for some people who have suffered a large loss, there isn't a reason for everything. It seems so random. Somebody's driving down the road and they get hit by a car. That's just random. And maybe there isn't a reason for that. One of the things that kind of really changed my life was I was in the car with my husband and young daughter. We were driving to a friend's house, and we were witness to a fatal car accident. It was actually the car, like two cars in front of us. Another car swerved over the median and hit them head on. I got out of the car, to render first aid. The two people in the car were still alive at that point in time. And then I learned later on that they both had passed. And I thought, all they were doing was driving. They were driving safely. They were driving well. They were just living their lives. And now they're deceased. And so again, I would never tell those family members there's a reason for this loss, because maybe there's not. Again, what not to say? Aren't you over him yet? He's been dead for a while now. Obviously, I don't think anybody who's interested in helping people would be saying this. But again, this is a message people get often, that you need to get over it. If someone's lost a child, saying you can still have another child. That's often said to people who have had miscarriages or suffered stillbirths, or lost a young child. There's no replacement for a child that is lost. And so to say you can have another child is denying that loss and the importance of that loss. 7 is, she was such a good person, God wanted her to be with him. Again, this is cultural and religious. And again, if somebody wants to say that as they're grieving, that's a good feeling for them. And that might be a healthy coping skill for them, but it's not where they're at. And if we put that on them, then maybe they're very angry with God. Maybe they don't believe in God. Maybe they have a totally different version of what happens after death. So we have to be very careful about those spiritual, religious statements. I know how you feel. As a young therapist, I think I probably made this mistake sometimes, saying, oh gosh, I know how you feel. Gosh, that's awful. One time this happened to me, comparing losses, and we don't do that. Because we don't know how someone feels. Whether you lost your husband at 40 and someone else lost their husband at 40, you still can't say, I know how you feel, because the feelings are different. And that's where giving that space to acknowledge those feelings are really important. She did what she came here to do, and it was her time to go. This is a great statement for coping when it's said by, again, the person who is grieving. If they feel like, my mom lived a great life, she raised 4 kids and 20 grandkids, and it was just her time. If the person grieving says that, that's great. But it's not something for us to tell the person grieving. And number 10, be strong. This is, people don't need to be strong. They can be weak. They can be sad. They can be devastated, and they don't need to be strong. So that's important. Helpful words, what to say. These are the words that I think my friends who have had losses, and my family members who have had losses, and my clients who have had losses have told me have been helpful. When just somebody says, I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm just so sorry. I wish I had the right words. Just know I care. I don't know how you feel, but I'm here to help in any way I can. You and your loved one will be in my thoughts and prayers. My favorite memory of your loved one is this. This is really important. Sometimes when, especially if the person who is deceased is younger, a lot of times people feel for some reason they shouldn't talk about the person who was deceased. I have a friend who lost her husband, and the first Thanksgiving came after the loss, and the family was all together, and she said nobody said his name. And that was really hard for her. And it's hard for her when people get together and they don't mention him. So talking about the loved one, my favorite memory of your loved one, it's not hurtful. It's actually a helpful words. I am always just a phone call away. Remembering that if you're a friend to somebody who is grieving, to not only just be waiting on the other line, but also to call sometimes. Give a hug instead of saying something. Pre-COVID, this was what to do, but now, if you feel good, give a hug instead of saying something. Physical touch is really important. for people who are suffering from psychological distress. We know that physical touch lowers blood pressure and helps to release the hormones that are good feeling hormones. And so again, any kind of physical touch is helpful. We all need help at times like this. I'm here for you. And then I'm usually up early or late if you need anything. And then 10 is saying nothing, just being with the person. I think it's also important that we don't, especially if it's somebody we know or we have a connection with, not to wait for them to call us, because sometimes that reaching out is really hard to do. And so we want people to reach out to us. Healthy coping skills. So these are the things that I work on with my clients who are suffering or who are experiencing grief. Sorry, I don't like the word suffering. Who are experiencing grief, whether it's new grief or years old grief. These are some healthy coping skills that I work with my clients on. Again, spirituality, whatever that spirituality is, defining it, defining beliefs, looking to our spirituality to help us through hard events is important. Mindfulness, so grounding techniques, being present in the moment, listening to meditations. There's lots of meditations on loss out there. If you just go to YouTube, you can find many, many guided meditations on loss. I'm a big proponent of exercise. Exercise, again, releases those endorphins, gets us outside, sometimes is in group exercise, which is important. So exercise is important. Dealing with that physical side of grief is really important. Support groups we talked about. So having support groups be available is important, but also making sure that it's a good match. Referring somebody to a support group that's not a good match can be actually harmful to someone. So again, finding that support group that is a good match. Developing rituals or new traditions. So again, this might be doing something in honor of a loved one who is lost. It might be, hey, now every year, now that dad is gone, we're going to get together and do his favorite thing once a year. Or whatever that ritual is, we're going to plant flowers in mom's memory. We're going to, your friend loved the Cubs, so you're going to go to a Cubs game once a year to honor them. So those rituals or new traditions. Memory boards, so again, those boards that have, pictures and memories of the person. Journaling is every therapist's technique. Journaling and deep breathing, of course. So journaling is important, writing down those feelings. It's a space to have to write whatever you want. And when I recommend journaling to my clients, I say, write, draw, scribble, whatever you feel to do. Joining new activities is really important when the person is ready. So finding new outlets for their interests. Maybe that's joining a new bridge group or finding a new hiking group. Whatever that is, new activities are a good way to restart life. Therapy is important. So not everybody needs a therapist who's grieving, but therapy can be an important part of helping somebody to cope with a loss. Volunteering, similar to new activities, giving of yourself can be helpful in those times that you're feeling sad. We know that volunteering increases those feelings of meaning in life, and so that's important. Nature is a great one. So, recognizing, getting out in nature and recognizing what nature brings to us. It can be helpful in a lot of ways, in mindfulness, in spirituality, in exercise, in a new activity. So it kind of matches all of those. So getting out into the world is important. Special tokens. These are things that maybe can be made from a loved one's things, or are things that you carry. Shirts or pillows made out of the old shirts, shirts that someone wears, that someone wore. I've seen pillowcases made for grandchildren out of a grandfather's shirts. It might be something that the person had that they owned that is given to a loved one to kind of keep and hold on to. It may be a rosary or a cross, something spiritual, or it may be, this was his favorite book, so I'm going to leave it on my nightstand. So special tokens that help to remind you of the person and remind you of who they were. So as I'm ending, so we can have time for paperwork or for questions. This is another one of my favorite quotes about loss. And I present this to my clients as a way of saying, there's some good things about having somebody in your life that makes it so hard to say goodbye. How lucky I am to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard. Now, I have to be careful with this, because I don't ever want to say to somebody, well, look, you were lucky, you had a marriage for 50 years, so therefore you should be happy you had that marriage. No, it's just that you had such love. And that beginning quote, you know, grief is love that can't be given anymore. This is the same, you know, that immense amount of love that you had, how lucky we are to have had that, and then to look at how do we say goodbye. And that is my show. So I am going to unshare my screen here. All right.
Perfect. Hi.
Hi. So do we have
Okay, let me share the questions with you.
Yeah.
The first one is, do you use the 4 tasks of grief as an alternative to the stages of grief model? Can the 4 tasks of grief be included in treatment planning as interventions?
Yes. Yes, I think it's a great treatment plan. I really like the 4 tasks of grieving, and there's a couple different models out there of the tasks of grieving. There's the Dr. Worden one, WORDEN, 4 tasks of grieving, and then there's other ones as well. So yes, but those tasks of grieving can be really a great way to look at treatment planning with somebody.
Hold on. There's another question. How does one with anticipatory grief accept the finality of the loss when dealing with a loved one having Alzheimer's or dementia?
Yeah, so that's an important question, and probably a longer answer than I have time for. But with anticipatory grief, part of the problem is that they are dealing with the reality of life right then, which can be very difficult. You know, the caregiving role that they have, the physical problems that the person might have, and just the everyday of preparing for loss. And I think that during anticipatory grief, we can work with somebody on, you know, accepting that loss is going to happen, but also looking at how do we honor that person in the time that we have left with them. So with somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's, it's hard to have those conversations. You know, we talked about doing memory books and life review. You can do a life review for someone. You can do, so you can help the family members can help to bring that life review back into point. And at that point, you're really working with the caregiver and not the person who is dying, because they are not processing the death. They're not processing the fear at that point in time, especially if they have dementia. So it's working with the caregiver to really look at what might happen. And I know a lot of times in dementia and Alzheimer's, the person lives much longer than any family member or even the person themselves would want to live after, you know, losing their physical sense and their mental health. And so I think it's a very hard loss. It's kind of a specialized field in terms of working with somebody like that. But I think it's important to just leave room for every feeling that is occurring, which could be a lot of anger and a lot of guilt. And sometimes people feel guilt for wanting the person to pass away because it's done. And you know, like, why do they keep holding on? And we, you know, I used to work in a burn unit, and we always said the quickest way to get somebody to live longer, if they were on death's door, was to call hospice, because once we called hospice, then it seemed like they, you know, they lived longer, and not always in a good way, you know, not always in you know, if somebody's not productive anymore or not speaking anymore, that loss can be really hard. So I think it's really important to just to just pay attention to that and to make sure that we're dealing with every emotion that could be and allowing every emotion that can be there. And fear is a big emotion too.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions for the chat box? Oh wait, there's some Q&A. Hold on. How do tasks apply for anticipatory loss? I work with terminally ill.
Okay, so those tasks that I went over, the ones that I kind of work with, which are accepting reality. So again, that's something that probably when you're working with the terminally ill, you're working with either that person or their caregiver in terms of accepting that loss is going to happen. And that can be really, that's hard work and it's devastating work, but gosh, God bless you for working, doing that, because so accepting that reality and working through the pain. There's actually an opportunity, if you're working with somebody who doesn't have dementia or Alzheimer's, who is able to participate in that, working through that pain for both of them and together can be, especially if it's a couple or a parent and a child, can be really helpful in terms of working through that pain together. And adjusting to life without the deceased would be, making a plan for what will life look like after this. Making a plan with them for what am I going to do when my loved one is gone? How is that going to look? Sometimes planning funeral services, and I know during COVID that it's been a horrendous, situation in terms of not being able to have full funeral services or full celebrations of life. But sometimes planning that is really important. Planning planning a year out. What am I going to do? What kinds of things am I going to do to remember this person? What kinds of things am I going to do to get back on my feet? What am I going to need? So if a spouse is dying, it's a great time to be able to ask other people in your life, what am I going to need and how can you fit into that picture? And then obviously maintaining connection. I think it's important to, pick those rituals that you want to do and maybe even talk them over with the person who is dying about what would be important for me to do after you're gone. I think those conversations are really important. And again, life review, what have you done? And if you have, somebody who is dying, if they have guilt about things, working through that. That's a whole, a whole other topic on, working with the person who is dying in terms of working through their feelings about dying and their grief.
Okay, the next question, for anybody who needs to jump off, thank you for joining us. And we really appreciate it. A copy of the video will certainly go out to everybody in a couple of days. And for those who want to stay on, we'll do questions and answers for a couple more minutes. Trish, in your practice, have you encountered disenfranchised grief with individuals who are LGBTQ, especially those whose relationships may not have been recognized by family?
Yes, it's an important topic, and I apologize for not including it in my speech. So disenfranchised deaths in the LGBTQ community, it's really important, especially for our older adults where relationships aren't recognized. And sometimes what happens with disenfranchised grief can even be like being left out of funeral plans, being left out of any kind of memorial service. And it can be devastating. And so what we need to do in terms of that is we need to help them to develop their own coping skills, their own mourning. And maybe that's having a ceremony for just the people in their inner circle, in the LGBTQ inner circle that they may have. Maybe they don't have that at all. And so therefore that leads to somebody needing to kind of attend therapy to work through that because they don't have other people to work through that. Or people say, oh, she was just a good friend, or she was your roommate. you know, when in reality, there was a long-term love affair going on, and it's devastating. I really hope that it's getting better. But we see that even in hospitals where a partner, if they're not married, doesn't have access to somebody who is dying. COVID has made that somewhat worse too. If there's only one visitor in the family decides that they don't want the other person to be able to visit, that can be very devastating. And so we need to be proactive in that as people in the human services field to look at those rights and look at the ability to mourn, but also to help set up, if the family is not allowing that mourning, to set up a different place and setting for that mourning.
Thank you. How do we help those family members that idealized a relationship with the person who passed? Sorry.
This happens often. This happens. I was actually just having this conversation with a client yesterday about a loss and kind of making the person who died a martyr. And a lot of times people say, well, they weren't that great in real life. You know what? If it's helpful to idolize the person who's gone, I say let it go. Let them idolize that person and deal with the emotions that go along with that. I don't think after death is the right time to really be questioning, someone's worth. And so I think that it can be hard. It can be hard, especially in chaotic families where maybe the father was abusive to the mother and the father dies, and the children, have been kind of removed from that, adult children who see the father as being this abused person. And the mother wants to grieve wholeheartedly for that person. And so I think it gets very messy. But again, it's all in that space that you allow for those feelings to occur. It's all in allowing that every feeling that's coming up, and to acknowledge those feelings, and to not to question whether those feelings are right or wrong. Again, so you might, working with the daughter in that situation, you might be looking at her anger and dealing with anger and being able to let go of that anger so that she can mourn her father and move on. Or maybe she doesn't want to let go of that anger and wants to hold on to it, but it's always healthier to let go of anger. And maybe with the mom, you're working on just that intense grief of a loved one loss, whether they were a good person or a bad person, that it's still a loss. And so to reflect on that.
Okay, let's see. I think we're kind of through our questions at this point. Oh, here's the last one. Can we do one more? Just one
Sure.
last one. My friend's husband recently died after a 6-month stint in hospice. The very next day, she got rid of his clothes, tokens, etc. Isn't that atypical?
So, it can be atypical. Again, there's no right way or wrong way to grieve, and we kind of get stuck in this idea that there is, 6 months in hospice is a long time, and she may have had a lot of anticipatory grief and kind of dealt with those feelings before he passed, and then getting rid of his things was just a way for her to mark that transition. And again, some people will hold on to those clothes forever, but it's a way, some people see it as a way of marking the transition. Like, this is my new life. Yes, it's quick the next day. But again, I wouldn't question how someone does it. I would just, if you're working with somebody like that, to say, how did that feel for you? How did it feel to give away the clothes? Because somebody might say, it felt empowering. It felt like I can move forward. Again, 6 months, 6 months in hospice is a long time to be facing that death. And this might just be their transition into the next stage. And so I think we all want people to grieve in a healthy manner, but we have to remember that it looks different for every single person. It can be devastating for other family members. Sometimes, spouses get rid of everything and the family members are like, wait, I wanted dad's, Bible, or I wanted that. And that can be, difficult for families, and we need to work through that. But I think, especially with someone in hospice, those are important things to talk about ahead of time. And what are we going to do as we move forward?
Awesome. Well, that I think we are done for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any further questions for Trish, she is at abbytrish@gmail.com, which is now in the chat box. And please reach out to ElderWorks if there's anything they can do to assist you in your senior journey. And we are also always here to welcome people to the Belmont family if you need assistance with assisted living or memory care. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on our next CEU. And Trish, thank you for the amazing presentation.